Story 1. In 1315, the Battle of Morgarten. Duke Leopold of Austria personally leads some 2,000 knights and 4,000 men-at-arms in a bid to crush a force of 1,200 rebellious Swiss peasants armed with farm implements. These peasants have drunkenly raided a local monastery and aren't paying their taxes. Despite being warned multiple times by local scouts that he's walking into an ambush, Leopold confidently leads his entire force into a narrow choke point bordered by water on one side and steep hills on the other. The path is only wide enough for 2 men to walk side by side. The peasants have had time to prepare, and while the Austrian nobility joke and laugh below, they treat this as a no-holds-barred fight to the death. Once nearly the entire heavy cavalry column is in the obvious kill zone that Leopold has been warned about repeatedly, the Swiss peasants unleash a barrage of prepared logs and boulders down the hillsides, pulping the front and rear of the Austrian formation and cutting off both advance and retreat for the majority of the Austrian knights in an instant. Utter chaos ensues in the Austrian lines as panicked and confused men and horses crush each other to the point of asphyxiation. Huge numbers of knights and men-at-arms are shoved off the narrow path into the water, where they drown helplessly in their heavy armor. At the moment of maximum chaos, the Swiss peasants charge down the hillside, armed with crude polearms improvised from farm equipment. And to the shock of the Austrians, these combination spears, axes, and hammers on long poles turn out to be absolutely devastating weapons, capable of delimbering horses, dismounting knights, and delivering crushing blunt blows to heads and chests encased in heavy plate. What ensues is an absolute and merciless slaughter of the Austrian nobility by a much smaller force of lightly armored peasants. Leopold barely escapes with his life, abandoning the bulk of his army to their doom, and warfare is changed fundamentally. Heavy cavalry has been exposed as vulnerable to this new type of massed polearm-wielding infantry. As for the peasants, they and their descendants organize into the Swiss pikemen, who go on to become the most feared and respected mercenary fighting force in Europe for a couple hundred years, even entrusted with personally guarding the Pope, which they do ceremonially to this day. All because Leopold didn't listen, walked into an ambush he knew about, and treated the whole thing as more of a hunting trip than a real battle.
To be fair to the cavalry, they were in a position where they couldn't fight. But the earlier Battle of the Golden Spurs in 1302 was an actual open field battle versus an ambush like at Morgarten. Here, the French cavalry faced Flemish rebels. And after they were softened up by crossbowmen and infantry, the mounted knights took the field. The terrain was terrible for cavalry. The Flemish had dug ditches connected to the river, flooding many, covered in brush. Plus, natural streams meant that by the time the French got past these and organized for a charge, they were too close to go full tilt. Still, they charged into the Flemish pikemen. They inflicted damage, but mostly the line held, and the infantry swarmed over them. Infantry are supposed to break under a charge by heavy cavalry. Well, that didn't happen, and those that couldn't get away had their horses cut out from under them or pulled down and slaughtered. The French took over 1,000 casualties over the whole battle, including 75 noblemen. The knights were the bulk of the dead. This battle is the first example of the infantry revolution of the 14th century, where infantry armies started beating mounted armies. The lesson learned is choose your battlefield. Do not let your enemy choose it for you. And that's exactly how the Swiss beat the Austrians in your example. I also admit I surely gloss over many fine details.
This kind of thing happens in movies at times, and it always infuriates me that the brilliant mastermind's plan relies on the other guys doing the stupidest thing possible, which they then proceed to do. But I guess sometimes it actually goes that way.
This should have been the sequel to 300.
Story 2. Alexander the Great conquered a vast empire. Then, on his deathbed, instead of crowning a successor, he told them his empire should go to the strongest. That triggered internecine warfare that tore the entire empire apart. I mean, it probably would have happened anyway, but holy shit, he just decided to speedrun it.
Seeing as how nobody will be happy with whomever I appoint, and y'all gonna be snakes in the end. Fuck it. Battle Royale this shit.
How could the empire have simultaneously been so strong as to permanently spread Hellenistic culture and so weak that many of its subjects did not even know it existed?
I wonder how often the scene with the peasants and King Arthur from Monty Python has happened. I am your king. And what? Even as Great Britain painted the map with Union Jacks, how much did that actually matter beyond the courts of Europe?
Story 3. When Scotland tried to create a colony in what is now the Darien Gap, nearly bankrupting their country in the process. To this day, the area remains undeveloped and incredibly treacherous.
The Act of Union soon followed. Scotland got England's help to save them from financial ruin, and England got Scotland to accept the Hanoverian succession and end the Old Alliance with France.
If I recall correctly, there was a time when Brazil was in desperate need of manual labor. They encouraged immigrants from anywhere. At the same time, Japan's economy was tanking. So many Japanese went to Brazil to work. They bought tracts of land and stayed. My friend is of Japanese-Brazilian descent. Her family went over after the second bomb drop. They feared the entire island was going to get bombed.
The first Mexican saints were martyred in Japan. It was wild seeing that little statue diorama of in the National Cathedral. Like, wait, are those Japanese people? Wait, what are they doing to those priests?
Story 4. Australia introduced cane toads from Hawaii into North Queensland in an attempt to control the cane beetle population destroying sugarcane crops. Unfortunately, the cane beetle lives at the top of the sugarcane, and the cane toad can't reach them. Cane toads ended up spreading throughout Queensland and most of Australia, causing a lot of damage to local ecosystems.
Gosh, this island is so unique, and its ecosystem so fragile. Let's drop in an animal that loves to breed. The British, every 10 years until the sun swallows the land.
Actually, that's not quite right. Australia did not introduce cane toads to try to contain the cane beetle. One dumbfuck, shit-for-brains entomologist introduced cane toads to try to control the beetle. He had absolutely no government permission to do it. He was just working under a consortium of sugarcane growers. They did no studies, no theorizing about ecological impact. They never even made sure the toad would eat the fucking beetle. They brought over a bunch in a suitcase, bred them up, and let them go. The negligent idiot's name was Reginald Montgomery.
Probably the most quotable episode ever. So many great moments. I'm taking this all the way to the Prime Minister. He walks over the hill to see the Australian leader floating in a lake, drinking a beer. Hey, Prime Minister.
Story 5. Western Union, who owned the telegraph lines, which worked absolutely fine with telephone technology, told Alexander Graham Bell that they weren't interested in his new invention because they don't deal in gimmicks. It has gone down as the most expensive business decision in history.
This is the same pattern with every disruptive technology. The old tech is baked into a business model and has certain key performance indicators that the existing players recognize. In this case, I would guess that telegraph via Morse code has a greater transmission distance and better reliability than voice calls. Western Union would have charged per message and had a network of offices and people to deliver messages. To embrace voice phones would have required a complete revision of their business model and network. Faced with such a big change, management would naturally have underplayed the benefits of voice calls, simple confirmation bias, as the implications of doing otherwise would have been too much to consider.
There's more. Western Union wasn't a bunch of green-visored telegraphers tapping away in a back room. It was a very sophisticated business, the first to use frequency multiplexing on their lines, one of the few inventions Edison actually invented, which sent 8 signals on a line at the same time, using 5 tones each for a 40-tone multiplexing system. Telegraphs were sent by being punched into paper tape, and electrical feelers went through the holes to make a contact that sent the individual letters, called the Baudot multiplex system. The code Western Union used was one of the major influences when ASCII, American Standard Code for Information Interchange, was developed. Not only that, but they used their infrastructure to make money in other ways. They had a time service, which sent signals via telegraph wires to schools, factories, train stations. The last remnants of which were the old-style clunk clocks in schools. Those weren't clocks. They were mechanical displays driven by a signal sent from the front office of the school. Even the delivery boys were used for other things. You could send a shipment of something like catalogs to a Western Union office in a city, along with a list of addresses, and the delivery boys would distribute them. All in all, the more you dig into it, the more you see them as a complex business that was already using its equipment as much as they could. Telephones were an untested technology that would have used resources that were already making the company money.
There's little more to it than that. The technology did not work anywhere near as well as the current telegraph system. It would take years or decades of development before the telephone was better than the telegraph.
Story 6. Four Pests Campaign. The extermination of sparrows, also known as the Eliminate Sparrows Campaign, resulted in severe ecological imbalance. It was one of the causes of the Great Chinese Famine, which lasted from 1959 to 1961, with an estimated death toll due to starvation ranging in the tens of millions, from 15 to 55 million. In 1960, the campaign against sparrows ended, and bedbugs replaced them as an official target.
I was taught that the Chinese famine was caused by my not eating everything on my plate.
Then, having learned nothing, we caused the Ethiopian famine by not eating our lima beans.
Thank you for pointing this out. If only I had choked down the inedible food-like substances during my childhood, China would have been saved.
Story 7. Remember that one time the Boston Police Department caused a citywide bomb scare? They somehow mistook an LED sign advertising Aqua Teen Hunger Force for an improvised explosive device. That caused them to arrest the marketers and charge them with perpetrating a bomb hoax. After they were let go, the Boston Police Department refused to apologize, and to this day, they still refer to it as a bomb hoax. Story 8. Stalin once demanded to speak to a particular general. The problem was that he had been arrested a couple of weeks earlier, in a purge. But it turned out that the NKVD goon squad had thrown him in a cell, then got drunk and never filled out the form to have him shot. So he was still in the cells. He had his meeting with Stalin, and nobody said a word about his earlier arrest.
On the topic of Stalin, the guy plotted a purge of every single doctor in the country at age 74, and then proceeded to die of stroke with no medical assistance available.
Story 9. So many possibilities outside of current events. There have always been tyrannical rulers. I'm going to focus on some weird, dumb moments in history. There was the time a beached whale washed up in Oregon in the 1970s, and officials decided the best way to dispose of it was to blow it up with dynamite. It damaged cars and everything nearby. President Jimmy Carter was attacked by a crazed, swimming rabbit. There was an emu war in Australia, where infantry fought 20,000 emus, and the emus won. Thomas Jefferson publicly accused John Adams of being a hermaphrodite. Andrew Jackson had a vulgar pet parrot that someone snuck into his funeral. It crashed the funeral with its foul language. Britain tried to reduce the cobra population in India by offering cash rewards for every dead cobra brought in. Pretty soon, people started farming and breeding cobras to cash in. When the government figured it out and stopped the program, the breeders released all those cobras back into the wild, making the population even bigger than before.
The Emu War is so played out, and it's also far from the dumbest thing in our history. We straight up lost a prime minister. Dude just went for a swim and disappeared. To this day, nobody has any idea where he went.
One conspiracy theory is that he faked his own death and was picked up by a Chinese submarine.
On the subject of cobra population control, feral pigs in the United States are following a similar pattern. Farmers complained about the damage to their crops, so people started trapping and hunting them to reduce their numbers. Hunting feral pigs became so popular that it has become a big industry, and eradication is unlikely to happen.
Story 10. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was just a series of dumb luck moments and failing upwards.
The assassins were hilariously inept. One of them tried to kill himself by taking a cyanide pill that was old and degraded, and then drowned in a river that was too shallow to drown in. This was after he threw a bomb that missed the Archduke's car.
I'm a fan of the theory that this event is proof of time travel, but that the Final Destination model is true. So many time travelers tried to prevent the assassination to keep the war from happening, but fate kept responding so that it happened anyway.
Monty Python shit right here. Drat. Missed. Oh well. Shall we have another go at it?
Story 11. Dude shoved a bottle up his ass. His country splits into 7 after multiple genocides.
Right, so What happened is a guy shoves a bottle up his ass because that's where the prostate is. Then it gets stuck, so he has to seek medical treatment. He's too embarrassed to say, "Hey, I was masturbating and stuck a bottle up my ass," because that's gay, and it was genuinely really quite embarrassing and socially ruinous. So he lies and says, "I was just minding my own business when, out of nowhere, I got ambushed by a bunch of Albanians." This is roughly the same as a black guy saying a bunch of white guys ambushed me and shoved a bottle up my ass. It's not unbelievable. Racists do that kind of thing sometimes. So the doctor tells people, they get angry and they attack Albanians, and it spirals out of control from there. Of course, it's also possible that he genuinely was ambushed. It just seems unlikely.
Dude, just the article summary sounds ludicrous, and I feel it's missing some connectors. Because it was an incident involving a farmer being treated for injuries stemming from a bottle inserted into his anus that inflamed ethnic tensions between Serbs and Albanians. What?
Motive disputed. Anal masturbation or land dispute.
Story 12. The Berlin Wall collapsing. Dude hadn't read his notes and improvised on the spur of the moment. Happy little accident. Story 13. Louis XVI was not a bad man, but he was a terrible king. More specifically, a terrible king to have in a crisis. And often, he seemed to have a radar for doing the one thing that was sure to take an already volatile situation and throw it into overdrive, talking about the French Revolution. There are lots of candidates, but the one that sticks out the most is the letter he left behind during the flight to Varennes. Louis had, for the most part, played along with the revolution for years. He put on a good face, generally said the right things, and seemed positioned to maintain some power as a constitutional monarch when the dust finally settled. But the letter he left behind when he and his family fled Paris destroyed any possibility of that happening. In the letter, he took off the mask and made it clear he hated the revolution, hated what he'd been forced to go along with, hated all of it, which made it nearly impossible for his allies to defend him. And, of course, he was caught fleeing. He and his family were caught in Varennes and forcibly marched back to Paris. But because he had left behind the letter declaring he hated the revolution, the mood and energy of the public towards the royals shifted even further into dangerous territory. It wasn't exactly a picnic up till then, but I think the flight to Varennes ultimately cost Louis his head. Completely unforced error, leaving that letter behind. Story 14. When it rained really hard, the window well in my room filled up with water. I showed my dad. He looked at it and then he opened the window. Story 15. The mostly accidental genocide of nearly all of the populations of the Andaman Islands comes to mind. If you ever wonder why the Indian government is so deadly serious about protecting North Sentinel Island, look into the history of the related islands. Story 16. These are all cute stories, but we know that the truest dumb moment in history was Blockbuster refusing to buy Netflix.
Both would have gone bankrupt. Blockbuster management was incompetent.
Story 17. When they put radium in watches and were obsessed with spraying kids with fucking insecticides.
Arsenic in wallpaper was another clanger.
The radium one might be more evil than dumb, since the people in charge knew the dangers, but lied to people and said it was safe. An interesting article describes how, after a few strokes, a brush tended to lose its shape, so the women's managers encouraged them to use their lips and tongues to keep the tips of the camel hair brushes sharp and clean. The glowing paint was completely flavorless, and the supervisors assured them that rosy cheeks would be the only physical side effect to swallowing the radium-laced pigment. The owners and scientists at US Radium, familiar with the real hazards of radioactivity, naturally took extensive precautions to protect themselves. They knew that Undark's key ingredient was approximately 1 million times more active than uranium, so company chemists often used lead screens, masks, and tongs when working with the paint.
They used asbestos for the snow in The Wizard of Oz.
Story 18. The discovery of the New World. Christopher Columbus went to find a western passage to India. That's why some of the Caribbean is called the West Indies. In his 1492 voyage, he thought he had found India. He went back and forth about 6 times. It wasn't until Amerigo Vespucci figured out it was something entirely new that it was named America after him. So, I'd say a professional explorer who went back and forth 4 to 6 times. I can't remember which, from Spain to the West Indies and not realizing it was a whole new continent. Actually, 2 is pretty dumb. Story 19. When Alexander tried to invade the Indian subcontinent, according to Greek sources, he supposedly won. Yet he decided to quit the war altogether because his soldiers became demotivated. He died on the way back home. There are no Indian sources to confirm his presence or his victory. Everything we know comes from Greek sources. It is reasonable to conclude that the invasion of the Indian subcontinent destroyed his ambition, self-confidence, and drive, and resulted in his death. It would have been better not to invade the subcontinent.
His actual retreat route is probably the worst route out.
From Alexander to successive Islamic invaders, history shows how much energy was wasted in futile attempts to conquer India. Ironically, they might have achieved far more had they targeted any other part of the world.
The British conquered India very easily, though.
Story 20. I'm still going to say hiding behind the Maginot Line at the beginning of World War II, despite the Germans having proved twice beforehand that they can and will go around it via Belgium.
But that wasn't the plan. In World War I, the Germans did indeed go through the Low Countries. In World War II, the plan was that as soon as Germany attacked the Low Countries, the British and French were to enter in force and defend the area, which is exactly what happened. What was not anticipated, however, was a German armored thrust through a relatively small gap in the Ardennes forest, which everyone had believed wouldn't be possible to quickly move through. The forest separated the Maginot Line from the main British and French forces rushing into the Low Countries. It's how that whole force ended up being isolated and surrounded at Dunkirk.
On the topic of World War II, Hitler declaring war on the United States has to be up there. He didn't really need to do it, and many thought it was a dumb idea. Turns out it was a very dumb idea, at least for the Nazis. Winston Churchill was pretty damn happy about it, though.
Especially since, in the context of that point during World War II, Britain had already declared war on Germany. I could see the logic in assuming they wouldn't go that route in the First World War, assuming everyone knew this would drag Britain into the war, and the Germans would obviously want to avoid that. Since that line had already been crossed, Germany had literally no reason not to invade through Belgium the second time around.
Story 21. You remember the Simpsons movie, where Bart says, "This is the worst day of my life," and Homer replies, "The worst day of your life so far. Every day for the past year and some odd days has been the dumbest moment in history so far." Story 22. When the United States re-elected a reality TV star because the guy who came after him was boring. Story 23. Re-electing to the most powerful position in the world a mentally ill wannabe despot who not only drove his country backwards during his first presidency, but then incited a violent anti-democratic insurrection to try to overturn his subsequent election loss. Story 24. There was supposed to be a gradual lifting of the Iron Curtain, but an East German official misspoke, and within hours the wall was being torn down. Story 25. The woman who searched for a missing person from her tour group for hours before realizing she was the missing person herself. Story 26. In America, today is the dumbest moment in history. Don't worry though, tomorrow will soon be the dumbest moment in history. Story 27. The US electing Trump as president. That was one dumb moment. But to do it again. Wow. Story 28. Hey, I'm just a profoundly narcissistic TV celebrity with delusions of adequacy, but I'm going to make an uninformed medical pronouncement with dire consequences. There is a plague with potential life-altering consequences coming, but true patriots should buy my deluxe Bibles. Ignore the Centers for Disease Control. Take a few of these horse tranquilizers, drink a little bleach, and shine a bright light up your ass. Do it because I intuitively know more about everything than anybody else. Story 29. When the United States thought it was an absolute fucking dandy idea to vote Trump in a second time. A second time. Story 30. The time the Khwarezmian Empire was wiped from the map. Because the ruler executed a Mongolian trade caravan containing 450 men, and then killed some messengers Genghis Khan had sent to demand justice diplomatically. It was one of the bloodiest wars in human history, with estimates of 10 to 15 million Khwarezmian casualties and very low Mongolian losses. Story 31. The Anglo-Zulu War started because the British intervened in a conflict so minor, it started as a bar fight. Story 32. The repeated invasions of Russia in winter, despite massive failures each time, that's a goodie. Like, hey, this didn't work for the other guys, but I bet it'll work for us.
It's not that they invaded in winter. They knew about the Russian winter, so they invaded in the summer. The stupid part is that they thought Russia would be quick and easy to defeat.
The blunder was not going for Moscow when they could see the Kremlin right in front of them.
Hitler was so convinced that they would win before winter that he refused to supply winter clothing during the Operation Barbarossa planning period.
Story 33. The pseudo-myth about that one Maori elder who was completely unimpressed by the grand technology of the British Empire. Story 34. When I forgot to bring my basketball shoes to the basketball tournament 5 hours away. Story 35. Every moment in time when people couldn't figure out how something happened, they decided it must be a higher power. Story 36. World War I. Yeah, it sucked that an archduke and his wife were assassinated. But why the heck did millions of people have to die just because a bunch of rich world leaders got into a pissing match?
People wanted to fight because they thought they would win by Christmas, and it had been over 100 years since an all-out brawl, so people had romantic views of war. Plus, the French wanted revenge for the War of 1871 and Alsace-Lorraine back as a matter of national pride. I once did a presentation about the July 1914 crisis versus the Cuban Missile Crisis not spiraling into war. One of the understated factors was that the leaders had no illusions about what World War III would look like, based on first-hand experience. John F. Kennedy had his boat sunk fighting the Japanese in the Solomons, while Khrushchev was in Stalingrad during most of the battle, including the very worst parts, among other parts of the Eastern Front.
Story 37. The Vietnam War stands out to me. It shattered trust in government here in the United States, and the human cost on both sides was devastating. Story 38. Recent? In 2020, Utah had the opportunity to rectify 2 centuries of backward treatment of women, polygamy, women not being able to lead their church, prioritizing homemaking as a career choice for their state's teenage girls, and so on. And then the state had the Equal Rights Amendment fall into their laps as the possible final tipping point state to approve it and get the entire thing ratified across the nation. And that moment came basically after all the controversy about the ERA's tenets had deflated and become common belief. Indeed, 70% of the state's populace approved of it, according to a poll. Utah sat there with a moment to rectify and join the good side of history, and they failed to pass it. They could have created a soundbite for their state that would have echoed through the ages, a very successful pushback against centuries of apt criticism, and they shrugged it off and failed to pass. Dumb, dumb, dumb. Story 39. It seems like an impossible question to answer. A span of infinite time with over 100 billion people involved, and then each and every individual interaction and event possible. Story 40. In this thread, not the dumbest moments in all of history, just Americans bitching about their politics.
There's some gold in here, though, once you dig through all the static.
Story 41. 1914, when it seemed like a good idea to start a war that would end up engulfing most of the world over some nobleman's murder.
Not just some nobleman, but the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary. Still, I get it. Millions of lives lost for one dude. Which reminds me of an article from The Onion in 1914, in our dumb century. Assassination of Archduke spreads fear at Archduke Convention.
And that reminds me that I need to find my copy of that book. One of my favorites is related to the Titanic. Did Jazz sink the great ship?
Story 42. The guy who thought that adding enough lifeboats to the Titanic would make the deck too crowded, as in too difficult for rich people to walk around in their fancy clothes.
Now, why it had so few lifeboats? They didn't think that the ship would sink quickly if it did sink, which they thought unlikely anyway, and it was for use in the North Atlantic, which was a very busy route. Therefore, they thought they'd be able to ferry passengers to another ship and come back for more.
Story 43. I've been watching a lot of World War II documentaries. Hitler's high command didn't want to wake him up during the D-Day invasion. That really cracks me up. It worked out in the end, though. Story 44. I'd like to say France, who decided to fund and support America's Revolutionary War just so they could screw over Britain. And now France was even more broke than they were before, while also having seeded revolutionary ideas against an oppressive monarchy in their own country. Story 45. It's a tie for me. 1. The Great Emu War. Australia literally declared war on birds with machine guns, and the birds won. 2. The Mars Climate Orbiter. NASA burned up a $125 million satellite because one engineering team used metric units and the other used imperial. Math is hard. Story 46. Ronald Wayne, one of Apple's co-founders, sold his 10% stake back to Jobs and Wozniak just a few months after the company's founding, for only a few $100s. Story 47. Bush landing on an aircraft carrier with a banner behind him saying, "Mission accomplished." Story 48. In the present day, many believe that the stars have something to do with their emotions. Story 49. The Battle of Karansebes in 1788. Austrian soldiers mistakenly attacked their own army, causing thousands of casualties before the enemy even arrived. Story 50. Today I learned that Australia once lost a war to birds, and it's not even a joke. So back in 1932, Australia decided it had beef with emus, like actual emus. These 6-foot murder ostriches were ruining wheat farms, and the government's solution was apparently to send in the military. They rolled up with machine guns, assuming this would be a quick side quest. Nope, the emus immediately unlocked guerrilla tactics. They scattered, sprinted in zigzags, tanked bullets like they had DLC armor, and just kept eating crops. The soldiers' guns jammed. The emus adapted. One officer reportedly said the birds were invulnerable, which is an insane thing to admit about a bird. After weeks of failure and public embarrassment, Australia officially called it off. Final score: emus still running free. Australian military emotionally devastated. Internet undefeated for content. History is wild because this really happened and no one learned anything. Story 51. In 249 BC, prior to the naval battle of Drepana in the First Punic War, the Roman consul Publius Claudius Pulcher was advised to consult the sacred chickens. The sacred chickens indicated that the Romans should avoid conflict. Pulcher threw the chickens overboard, cracked a joke about it, and they went on to lose the entire Roman navy along with 20,000 men in the battle that followed. You don't have to have sacred chickens, but if you do have sacred chickens, you should probably listen to the sacred chickens. Story 52. Probably November 4th, 2024, when America doubled down on stupidity and voted in again the most vile and corrupt man to ever hold the office of the president. Story 53. Not really a moment since it took months, but the voyage of the 2nd Pacific Squadron has to be up there. The year was 1904. Russia was at war with Japan, and it wasn't going well for them. They decided to redeploy ships from the Baltic Fleet to Vladivostok as reinforcements. The whole thing was a shit show. Highlights include accidentally destroying telegraph cables with their anchors, bringing alligators and venomous snakes on board as pets, and almost starting another war with England by shooting at some fishing boats. As soon as they got close to their destination, they were all sunk by the Japanese Navy. If you haven't heard of it, there are some videos out there that cover it in more detail. Story 54. Didn't the United States accidentally drop a nuclear bomb on itself? And it only didn't explode because it was broken? Story 55. Re-electing that buffoon for a second term? Did you not learn the first time? Story 56. Pretty sure that as of late, every day is the dumbest moment in history until tomorrow anyway.
Huh. Just wait until you see 2 days from now.
Story 57. The re-election of Trump. I'm from the United Kingdom, and seeing America unravel is like watching a big, lovable but slightly eccentric cousin start doing meth and develop a habit of recreationally shooting themselves in the foot. Story 58. The whole dancing plague of 1518 is up there. A bunch of people in Strasbourg just started dancing uncontrollably for days. Some until they died. No reason, no poison found, just mass hysteria. Peak what is even happening energy.
How's that dumb? This was due to a still unknown illness. The people affected didn't have a choice. They weren't doing this for fun.
Story 59. The number of people who are beyond insufferable saying that today, now, the day Trump got elected is absurd. Reddit continues to show that it isn't a real place. Are you telling me the dumbest mistake in all of human history happened in the present day? Not Hitler or Napoleon deciding to invade Russia in winter, both of whom were capturing countries left and right, only to lose all momentum. The Treaty of Versailles, the 2008 financial crisis, where banks gave loans like candy to anyone who wanted one. The launch order at Chernobyl? Or how about the glaring one, the driver of Archduke Ferdinand taking the wrong turn, which resulted in World War I and the eventual World War II? Get your heads out of your asses.
But those other events don't farm as much fake internet points as asking this thinly veiled question that's just another, hey Reddit, how much do you hate Trump? Like all the other posts in this fucking subreddit.
Hitler and Napoleon both invaded the Soviet Union in June.
Story 60. Designing democracy in a way that made Hitler possible. And then making the same mistake over and over again in different countries at different times.
Adolf Hitler was not directly elected as leader of Germany by a popular majority, but rather appointed chancellor on January 30th, 1933, through legal political maneuvering. While the Nazi Party won significant support in 1930's elections, peaking at 37.3% in July 1932, they never won a majority in a free election.
Story 61. Probably that time we found out the world was run by satanic pedophiles and then no one did anything about it. That was pretty bad.